The word I want to talk about is Deutsch. D-E-U-T-S-C-H. Yeah, you often hear people say, if they can't say anything else, they might say, Sprechen Sie Deutsch? Do you speak German?
Why do Germans call their language Deutsch and we call it German?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. The reason is that German is taken from the Latin Germanus Germani, and you might have heard of the historian Tacitus. He wrote a very famous little introduction to the German-speaking areas, which he called Germania. So that's where the German comes from, German, and we pronounce it in English German. The French, meanwhile, have a different name again. They talk about Allemand, and that's named after a particular tribe in southern Germany. The Alemanni, we would call them using the Latin term, and the Germans themselves would talk about Alemannisch. Deutsch itself has a really interesting history. It literally means of the people. So it was used originally to contrast with Latin. So people spoke either Latin or they spoke the language of the people. That word was first borrowed from German into Latin, and we ended up with this term like Theodisk. Theod is people, and then isk is the ish bit, so people-ish, literally. That got into Latin as Theodiska, and then it was borrowed back into German as a term for the language and the people, and ended up going through various changes and becoming Deutsch. I guess I need to explain why I think it's an interesting topic, and one of the reasons it's interesting is because German or Germany and Britain have had such a complicated relationship, not just from World War II onwards, but even before then. And that's reflected in how and why people have been learning German. And it's also interesting looking at how the German language itself, Deutsch, is portrayed to English learners, because it's often not the same as the way in which German learners learn about German. One thing that is quite common, and it's not just for people who are English learning German, but more generally when you're learning a foreign language, people are much more, authors of textbooks are much more ready to accept changes in the language and to put them in the textbooks, whereas you might not find changes like that happening in the German grammars of the language. And a good example of that is a word wegen, which just means because of. It's quite a common word in German. You might say because of the weather, I couldn't go out today, wegen dem Wetter. But how that word is used has changed, whether you say wegen dem Wetter or wegen des Wetters. And I don't want to go into the technicalities of it too much, but there's two different cases, two different grammatical sets of endings that you use there. Now, the German Bible, if you like, of correct usage is something called the Duden, and that still tells you that to say one particular variant is incorrect. It says it's frequent and lots of people use it, but it's still officially incorrect. Whereas what you find is that in British textbooks and grammars about German, people are just accepting this has happened, the language has changed, and this is just the way it is now. So there's a different attitude to what is the standard language, what can I accept as correct. I think there's a couple of different reasons. One reason is that I think people are more conservative about their native language in any case. And I think the other reason is that there's a difference between how British people see the language and how German people see their language. So you find, I had an example in class this morning actually, where I was talking to a student, in fact, about the word vegan, and a German native speaker who's a visiting student in my class said, yeah, you hear it, but it's not good German, or it's not correct German. Whereas I think a British person, if I use something myself, I think it's correct. And if it's not in the grammar, that's because the grammar hasn't caught up with me yet. So there is a real difference about where is the authority for what's correct and what's not correct. Well, German is still the biggest economy in Europe, so it's still a very important language. But the reason that people actually sit down and choose to learn a language tends not to be for rational reasons like that. It's an important language. Otherwise, we'd all be learning Chinese and Hindi or something. And more of us are, but still not as many as you'd expect. But increasingly German, it's interesting that the German government in particular, they have a whole organisation called the Goethe Institute that promotes German, and they are trying to promote German as a world language. I would say that German falls somewhere between French and English in how closely controlled its use is officially. So English doesn't have an official authority or an official body at all, and I think the closest we would come to thinking of an authority like that is looking up in the Oxford English Dictionary, and that's about as far as it goes. Do we spell nationalise with a Z or an S or something? French has the Académie Française, which is a formal governmentally appointed organisation that keeps a very close eye on things like borrowings and making sure that French alternatives are offered in place of English words if they're being used. German falls somewhere in the middle. Spelling is very closely regulated, and they had in 1996 a spelling reform, which was very controversial at the time because, well, partly because it was quite badly handled and partly because the details of the reform weren't popular with people. And that was implemented by government decree, but the actual Bible that you refer to for what is correct and what's incorrect is the Duden spelling dictionary, and that is run by a private company, the Duden Publishing Company. So it sort of falls somewhere between the middle. The state does have a hand in it, but not in the same way as the Académie Française.